A 100-year-old company collapsed in a single week, and the man announcing its death cried on live television, telling the country his employees had done nothing wrong. Behind him was one of the biggest hidden frauds in financial history. Over $2 billion in losses that had quietly been made to disappear for years, tucked away in a company nobody outside Japan had really heard of. And the strangest part might be how ordinary the reason was. Nobody set out to commit history's biggest cover-up. They just kept telling themselves they'd fix it next year, and next year never came. This is Yamaichi Securities, one of Japan's big four brokerages, founded in 1897 with roughly 7,500 employees and about 30 trillion yen of client money under its roof. Through the 1980s, Japan was riding an extraordinary asset bubble. Stock and real estate prices climbing so fast that losing money seemed almost impossible, and everyone from pension funds to manufacturing companies wanted in. Yamaichi took on discretionary investment accounts for about 10 major corporate clients, promising to grow their money with very little day-to-day oversight from the clients themselves. Then, in 1990, the bubble popped, and the Nikkei lost more than half its value within a couple of years. Here's the thing about Yamaichi. This wasn't its first brush with disaster. Back in 1965, the Bank of Japan had quietly bailed it out with emergency loans rather than let it fail. Part of an unspoken system where the government protected its biggest financial institutions no matter what. That precedent mattered because when the 1990s crash wiped out those 10 clients' portfolios, Yamaichi's executives didn't panic about survival. Quick side note before we go further. If you want the research templates and scripts behind breakdowns like this one, they're up on Gumroad, links in the description. Okay, back to Tokyo. Instead of panicking, Yamaichi's executives decided to just make the losses disappear. The technique was called Tobashi, Japanese for to make it fly away. Instead of reporting their corporate clients' investment losses like they were supposed to, Yamaichi's executives quietly shuffled the bad assets into affiliated shell companies whose books weren't included in Yamaichi's own consolidated financial reports. On paper, the losses vanished. The clients' statements looked fine, and Yamaichi's public earnings looked fine too. In reality, Yamaichi itself had just quietly agreed to eat well over 200 billion yen it couldn't actually afford to lose, betting that the market would eventually recover enough to make the whole problem disappear on its own. This wasn't a one-time cover-up. For years through the 1990s, as Japan's economy limped through what would later be called the lost decade, Yamaichi kept the scheme running, and the hidden debt kept growing, eventually reaching roughly 260 billion yen, over $2 billion. Publicly, Yamaichi looked like a normal, if struggling, brokerage, still opening branches and courting new corporate clients. Privately, a chunk of its balance sheet simply didn't exist anywhere regulators, auditors, or shareholders could see it, and the small circle of executives who knew the truth had every incentive to keep it that way. Then, in 1997, a completely separate scandal hit. Investigators found that Yamaichi, along with the other major Japanese brokerages, had been secretly funneling payoffs to a corporate racketeer, the kind of figure who'd buy a few shares specifically to threaten disruption at annual shareholder meetings unless he was quietly paid to behave. Yamaichi's chairman resigned that August to take responsibility. Its former president and 5 other executives were later arrested. And with regulators and reporters suddenly crawling all over the company's finances, the hidden Tobashi debt didn't stay hidden much longer. 1 week after a major Japanese bank collapsed outright, spooking markets across the region, investigators confirmed what Yamaichi had been hiding for years: roughly 260 billion yen in concealed losses, sitting off the books in entities nobody outside a handful of executives even knew existed. There was no way to quietly absorb a hole that size, and no more shell companies left to hide it in. On November 24, 1997, Yamaichi's board made the call. They would shut the company down voluntarily, ending exactly 100 years of business in a single boardroom vote. What happened next became one of the defining images of Japan's financial crisis. Yamaichi's president stood in front of the cameras to announce the shutdown and broke down in tears, telling the country that his employees had done nothing wrong. It was broadcast across Japan, again and again, replayed on every news channel for days. 100-year-old institution, gone, and the face of its collapse wasn't a villain in handcuffs. It was a man crying on television, apologizing to 7,500 employees for a mess he hadn't personally built and now had to explain to the entire country. Regulators moved fast to contain the damage. Yamaichi's 30 trillion yen in client assets got transferred to competing brokerages in an orderly handoff over the following weeks, so ordinary customers didn't lose their holdings even as the company itself came apart. But Yamaichi was finished, projected to leave behind roughly 3 trillion yen in unresolved debts on its own books, and nearly 7 trillion yen across the wider Yamaichi group, making it, at the time, the largest corporate failure in Japanese history. Yamaichi's former chairman was called before Japan's parliament, where he admitted knowing about the hidden debt for years, but denied any personal insider trading in the company's shares. Executives tied to the racketeer payoffs faced separate prosecution over that scandal. But the Tobashi scheme itself, the $2 billion hole at the center of the whole collapse, produced surprisingly little in the way of prison time for the executives who actually built it and kept it running for years. In June of 1999, a Tokyo court formally declared Yamaichi bankrupt, closing the book on a 100-year-old company for good. Here's the part that should make your skin crawl a little. The Tobashi technique that sank Yamaichi didn't die with it. It got more sophisticated, moved offshore through funds and shell entities that were much harder to trace, and resurfaced more than a decade later inside another major Japanese company, hiding billions of dollars in losses through the exact same basic idea: dressing up a hole in the books so nobody has to be the one who says the money's gone. If that story sounds familiar, it's because we've already covered it on this channel, and the parallels are honestly a little uncanny. Yamaichi wasn't brought down by one bad trade or one rogue employee. It was brought down by a decade of executives who'd rather quietly disappear a debt than admit out loud that the money was gone. The bailout culture that saved the firm in 1965 taught its leaders that failure simply wasn't an option. So when failure showed up anyway, they hid it instead of facing it, for as long as they possibly could. By the time the tears hit television, the choice had already been made for them, years earlier, by people who genuinely believed they'd find a way to fix it before anyone had to find out.